Welcome back. Often the question is asked, with all the things going on in the news, does it eventually work its way to economics? Well, we got the perfect person to help us answer that question. I'm always honored when we have time to sit down with Professor Michael Busler. He's a public policy analyst, and he's also a professor of finance at Stockton University there in New Jersey. He does have his own website, muckrack.com/Michael Busler, and there's a picture of that landing page as well. Professor, always good to see you, friend. How are you?
Doing very well, Perry. As you know, it's always my pleasure to be here.
Well, you always let us have your time, and I value it greatly. Thank you. Let me just kind of get out of economics just for a moment, but at the end of the day, we come back to it. Since President Trump's been reelected, there seems to be a significant shift in corporate America, not only bringing companies back, giving tax incentives, but when the DEI thing hit, it's spilling over into corporate America. What do you think about all that?
So, well, first of all, thanks for having me, Perry. You know, it's always my pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
So when President Biden was elected, he brought in this whole wokeism thing, looking at a bunch of things that were typically not very standard to American views. Now, corporations thought, well, if the president's doing it, you know, we're going to have to start adding diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to have to start catering to transgender people. Target, for instance, put a whole display of clothing for children, transgender children. You recall the, excuse me, Bud Light fiasco, where Bud Light's target market is essentially football watchers. And they decided to go woke too. They brought in Laney, put her or him into an ad, and it really turned off the Bud Light drinkers, and Bud Light sales ended up plummeting. Still, corporations, Walmart, among others, play to this wokeism. And then when President Trump got elected, and he said, look, we're going to do away with this diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to go back to more common sense, traditional, patriot-type values. And the company said, well, if that's where the market is, then we're going to have to follow that. And indeed, for corporations to make a profit, you have to give consumers pretty much what they want at the price they're willing to pay. Now, what they wanted under the Biden administration, the corporations thought was this wokeism. Turns out that America doesn't want that, and they're going back to more traditional values. The Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, said, look, we're going to get away from this liberal slant, and we're going to go toward more conservative views, kind of free market views. Many other publications followed, and it seems like it'll pay off for them in terms of their profitability, and they'll continue to hang on to their customer base.
So as they switch from wokeism, I guess, back to a form of nationalism, isn't there integrity in the balance here?
Well, look, as I said, corporations have to get to be profitable. You have to give people what they want. They thought what people wanted were this diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all this woke kind of thinking in their product line. Turns out that's not what consumers wanted. So they're realizing now that they made a mistake. They see with the election of President Trump and the return to traditional values, that's what consumers want, and corporations have to give consumers what they believe is what they want. You know, there's kind of a new definition I have one for diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I talk about diversity, I talk about diversity of thought and diversity of opinion. We have a democratic society, and we welcome healthy debate. Diversity has nothing to do with any demographic characteristics, just has to do with diversity of opinion, which is good. Equity, to borrow from a former professor of mine, equity means I keep what I earn and you keep what you earn. that's equitable. And inclusion, for every well-prepared American, regardless of any demographic characteristics, any well-prepared American, they'll be included in this new growing economy. So the new DEI is much different than the diversity, equity, and inclusion followed by the prior administration.
Did you think, looking at what you watch day in and day out, Professor, did you think that a corporation, Anheuser-Busch, taking Bud Light and turning it woke with this one character, would ever have the backlash that it hit? And it doesn't even appear now, even though they're trying hard to rebrand it, that people are buying it, that it seemed to be almost catastrophically damaging.
And it was. I think they lost 30% of their sales because what they were advertising is not what their target market wants. These people like to watch football games, male and female, and they like to drink their beer that they can identify with the football games and the true American spirit. When they brought on this Dylan Mulvaney, that's not what they wanted. It so turned them off that they said, I can't even drink this beer anymore. And Bud sales plummeted. I think it was about a 30% drop. Now, if you're trying to rebrand to the way you were before, it's going to take some time to do that because people still have in their minds that you had that person there advertising your beer and they don't want to identify with that person, much rather identify with a pro football player or somebody who's more American and more toward the American spirit and the traditional American views than what Dylan Mulvaney had. Trying to rebrand after a catastrophic mistake like this is very difficult.
A couple of other corporations that took a hit in the middle of all of this, Target stores, they took a huge hit during the middle of all this, and Disney can't seem to get traction again. I mean, when are they going to learn their lesson here?
Yeah, Target, they started to put out this transgender clothing line for children, and they had it displayed in the front of the store. So when you walked in, kind of that was the first thing that you saw. That really turned off a large section of their market, and as a result, their sales plummeted. Now they did away with it, or I pushed it, whatever they have left, way in the back, because they're not giving their customers what they want. Disney was an extremely profitable company, I think, since I was a kid and watching Mickey Mouse, and they did extremely well. Then all of a sudden, they said, well, instead of giving people what I think they want, let's give them what I think is socially acceptable. So they brought in all this woke stuff, and consumers and movie viewers said, this is not what we want. And they stopped going to Disney movies and stopped looking at Disney products, even the theme parks. So Disney had to turn that around. As you mentioned, it's very difficult when you make a blunder like that to rebrand. I think their latest movie is Snow White, and I think there's some controversy between some of the stars, and a lot of it has to do with their views on this wokeness.
I want to come back to media. You mentioned it briefly, Washington Post. You got the LA Times. You even had the other media now being caught, so to speak, if I could use that term, that they were being not only pushing wokeness, but they were demanding their editorial boards to be more on the woke side, and it's backfiring. Now, these are papers that industry in itself is in danger, but can they switch back and retain credibility?
I tell you, it's very difficult. LA Times had a very progressive editorial staff, and so much that not only in the editorials, but even in the factual news they were reporting, there was this liberal bias. And people started saying, well, is this really, I just want the facts here. Is this really the way it is? And it turned out it wasn't. So the owner of the LA Times said, look, we're going to have to change all this. They changed a lot of their editorial department, and they're going to try to change to what a newspaper is supposed to be. It's going to take time, and it may or may not work. Washington Post lost a lot of subscribers. Jeff Bezos said, look, we can't do this. We're going to have to change. But people start viewing the Washington Post as they do the New York Times, they tend to have a very liberal bias in their actual reporting. So now people start to look elsewhere, especially younger people who don't typically read newspapers and get their news from other places. It's going to be very difficult to lure people back to the LA Times and the Washington Post. They had one conservative, they called conservative columnist, Jennifer Rubin. She was supposed to be conservative, and she wasn't, and then when people read her, they kept saying, well, if this is the conservative view and they're giving you the liberal view, maybe this whole thing is right. And that didn't sit right with them. And they started to look elsewhere. Once to try to recover from blunders like this is very difficult. Now, I'm a free market economist, a follower of Milton Friedman. He used to say the only responsibility of corporations is to make a profit. These corporations said, no, we have more of a social responsibility, that we have to guide the public into doing things that somebody thinks is the right thing to do. And when you start to do that, it ends up having negative impacts on profits, and to try to change it is difficult.
So what is this doing to corporate America? I mean, do you think they're going to get back to free market values and just make money, or are they so bent on making a political statement even at the cost of profits?
The stockholders will not allow them to continue. Stockholders who owned the corporation bought that because they expected a profit, they expected dividends, they expected capital gains as the company grew. And if the management is doing something contrary to that, the stockholders will say either, look, you changed this, or I'm going to sell my stock and go to another corporation where I can take a look at what the returns are. So the stockholders will demand change, and the stockholders are the ones that own the corporation. Look, if owners of a corporation have social goals, that's fine. Let the corporation make the profit. That's what they're supposed to do. When the profits are distributed as dividends back to the shareholders, if they have causes they want to support, then as individuals, they have every right to do that. But you can't have the corporation trying to focus on these social goals rather than these financial goals.
Well, there was a part of this that went too far. DEI got involved in the hiring of people, and it was siloing people according to their classification, not according to their abilities. Therefore, it impacted not only service companies, but it certainly impacted companies' quality of product. Sooner or later, you have people doing a bad job.
This happens in education field too, and I see it all the time. I've been on search committees looking for a new dean or a new provost, dean for a school of business or a provost for the university. And the selection committee was more concerned with checking the diversity, equity, and inclusion boxes than they were picking the top people for the job. Now, when this happens, the education suffers. When it happens in business and you put somebody in there because they check the right boxes, but they're not the most qualified person to do the job, the quality of the product ends up going down. I think in education even, the quality of the education product has been going down as a result of these DEI policies. They have to change. You know, they follow Martin Luther King, and he always said, and he did say, we judge by the content of the character, not by the color of the skin. They're reversing that. They're judging by not the content of the character, but some demographic characteristic that seems to fill the needs for DEI. Outcomes are always negative.
Yeah. Well said. Let me take a quick break. Always an honor to have with us Professor Michael Busler. Check out his website, muckrack.com/Michael Busler. There's a picture of the landing page. Got some more questions concerning the big T. That's a word, not a name. We'll talk about it when we come back. Okay, welcome back. Always an honor to have with us Professor Michael Busler. He's a public policy analysis, and he's also a professor of finance at Stockton University there in New Jersey. Website, muckrack.com/Michael Busler. Professor, the big T word is not Trump, it's tariffs. And the reason I bring this up, it appears to me now that as I see him impose on tariffs and then pulls them back, that tariffs is now becoming a tool to get people to the negotiating table. How risky is this, and is it working?
Well, first of all, it does carry risks. And I'd also like to say, as a free market economist, I don't like tariffs on anything by anybody. If you want truly a competitive worldwide economy, you wouldn't have tariffs.
Right.
No, that's not going to be the reality. So what's Trump doing? So first of all, why people are so concerned is when you put a tariff on a product, it's like you're putting on a tax that adds to the cost of the product and tends to put upward pressure on prices. So people are now afraid of inflation, more inflation, and they're afraid if the prices get too high, consumers will really cut back on their purchases, and that could even lead to a recession. So generally, tariffs are not a good idea. However, Trump takes a look at how we treat other countries when they sell to us and how they treat us when we sell to them. The U.S. generally has about a 2.5% tariff on almost everything that's brought into this country. And if the rest of the world reciprocated with a 2.5% tariff, everything would be fine. However, that's not the case. The European Union, which is the one he's starting to work on now, we charge a 2.5% tariff on automobiles. When we try to sell an automobile in any of the European Union countries, they charge a 10% tariff. Some cars, as much as a 25% tariff. Mm-hmm. And that's why when you go overseas and take a look in Paris or Munich or any city, you never see any Chevrolets and Fords there because the tariffs are so high that people don't buy them. So President Trump said, look, I want to renegotiate this. I want things to be reciprocal. I'll charge you, you charge me the same thing. Now, the problem is our trading partners are reluctant to come to the negotiating table. Why? They've got a pretty good deal, so they don't want to come. So in business, if you have a partner that won't come to the negotiating table, what you have to do is create a sense of urgency. So he says, I'm putting a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada. I'm going to put on some products from Europe, like some of the wines and champagnes and things, I'm going to put a 200% tariff. Well, this would devastate the economies of those countries. So the best thing for them to do, which is exactly what Mexico did, come to the bargaining table, let's renegotiate something and work out something that's fair. And that's what Mexico did. Canada got a little bit of a huffiness. Well, if you're charging us 25% tariffs, we're going to charge you 25% tariffs. And even keep the high tariffs that we have in place. For some of our dairy products, they set a quota for how much we can ship to Canada. Once you go above the quota, the tariff jumps to like 200%. So that's limited the amount of dairy products and other products that we can sell in Canada. Now, Trump said, we charge you a 2.5% tariff on everything. Canada says, well, we're trying to protect our farmers. Trump said, okay, we'll protect our farmers and industry and lumber industry and steel and aluminum too. So Canada started this tit for tat that can't go on. Not so much for us. We can absorb a little bit. Maybe inflation ticks up slightly, but it won't hurt much. Canada, if we keep a 25% tariff on everything, it will devastate their economy. Why? Their GDP in US dollars roughly is a little over $2 trillion. Almost 20% of that, nearly $400 billion, they produce and sell in the US. We put a 25% tariff on their goods and it knocks it from 400 down to 300. That $100 billion drop is a 5% drop in their output. That'll plunge them into recession. They can't afford to allow this to happen. So what Trump wants to do, and he doesn't want tariffs on anything either. He just wants everything to be fair. And until it is, we're going to tariff you the same way you tariff us. If Canada, like Mexico, was smart, they would come to the negotiating table, and I think they're starting to do that, and you try to work out something that's more equitable on both sides. Otherwise, we'll keep the tariffs. Car companies are going to say, look, it's not, we can't produce cars in Canada or Mexico and sell them in the U.S. So Honda, for instance, announced we're going to build our plant outside the U.S. Now we're going to build it in Indiana. And Trump would like a lot of that to occur. So your original question was, are these tariffs going to stick, or are they a negotiating tactic? They're primarily a negotiating tactic unless the other side is not fair with us. In that case, they'll put the tariffs on. Let me say one other thing. With China, things are a little bit different. Because the labor cost in China is so low, $1 an hour, American companies say, well, let's go to China. We'll make all these goods, bring them back, and it's cheaper than if we made them here. The problem is when you start to get some vital products, and we're in somewhat of an adversarial position with China, it may disrupt supply chains. For instance, I remember during COVID, all of a sudden everybody had to wear a mask. Well, the American companies made all the masks in China. So they made them all, loaded them onto a ship. They had a shipload of masks on the way over here. And China said, wait a second, this pandemic is pretty bad here. Turn that ship around and send it back to China. That created a shortage of masks. A 50-cent mask was going for $5 because we had such shortages. Trump doesn't want that to happen in the future. He wants American manufacturers to bring their manufacturing back to the U.S. Let me say one other thing. People say to me, well, I understand that, but it's going to be more expensive to produce in the U.S. That means we're going to have to pay more for things. That's partially true. What will offset that inflation is two things. One, when we bring the manufacturing back to the U.S., it will not be labor intensive. It will be capital intensive, which means we'll have robots on the production line, artificial intelligence, automation, all of those things will be used to keep the manufacturing costs down, considering the labor costs in the U.S. are very high relative to the rest of the world. The second thing is, Trump believes, rightfully so, that much of the inflation we have today is due to high energy prices. Why do we have high energy prices? The Biden administration literally on day one took action to reduce the supply of energy, which they did. And when you reduce the supply of anything, the price goes up. Energy affects the consumer price index, 7% of the consumer price index directly. Indirectly, almost 30%, because it affects the cost of manufacturing, providing services, et cetera. So what Trump said is, I'm going to vastly increase the supply of energy. Now, when you increase the supply of anything, it will bring the price down.
Right.
He believes he'll be able to get it cut in half by the end of the year, and that's how he's going to fight inflation.
Well, at the end of the day, it looks like tariffs being used as a tool to create at least reciprocal tariffs. And if reciprocal tariffs end up being the end goal of the current tariffs being used as the tool, that opens the door, quite frankly, for no tariffs.
Yeah. Historically, countries just like to have a 2.5% tariff. I don't know why. They should all be zero. But if everybody's at 2.5%, which is, I think, ultimately the goal, zero would be great. We'll never get there. But if it gets down to 2.5%, that'll on both sides, that'll work marvelously. Open up all these markets to U.S. goods, agricultural in particular.
Okay, more to talk about later. Good to see you, friend. Let me say to our viewers and listeners, check out the professor's website, muckrack.com/Michael Busler. There's a picture of the landing page. Thank you, Professor. Have a great day, friend. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Always my pleasure, Perry. Take care.